The wedding gown had been her mother's, altered by trembling hands over 3 sleepless nights to accommodate Nova's swollen belly. Ivory silk cascaded over the curve where her pup grew, delicate lace covering her shoulders like frost on winter branches. She had thought herself beautiful when she'd looked in the mirror that morning, had allowed herself one foolish moment of hope that perhaps Cain would see her differently today, that perhaps the cold distance in his eyes would thaw when he spoke their vows. She had been wrong. The great hall of Thornwood Pack stretched before her, packed with wolves who had known her since childhood. Faces she recognized, the baker who slipped her extra bread rolls, the healer who had confirmed her pregnancy with gentle hands, the elderly seamstress who had helped alter this very dress, all stared at her with something between pity and morbid fascination. Nova's wolf stirred uneasily in her chest, a low whine building in her throat that she swallowed down with practiced ease. Cain stood at the head of the hall, his beta medallion gleaming against his chest. He was handsome, she supposed, in the way that sharp things were handsome, all angles and edges, with eyes the color of winter storms. Those eyes had never looked at her with warmth, not even when he'd taken her to his bed, not even when she'd whispered the news of her pregnancy against his shoulder in the dark hours of morning. She should have known then, should have recognized the way his body had stiffened, the long pause before his carefully neutral response. "Our guests have gathered," Cain announced, his voice carrying through the hall with practiced authority. He didn't look at her as he spoke, his gaze fixed somewhere above the crowd. "And before we proceed with the formal binding, I have an announcement to make regarding the circumstances of this union." Nova's heart stuttered. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly, where her pup kicked once, hard, as if sensing her sudden terror. "Something is wrong," her wolf whispered. "Something is very, very wrong." "My mate carries a pup," Cain continued, and the word mate fell from his lips like something rotten, something he couldn't wait to spit out. "As is proper for a beta's household, this child will be acknowledged as my blood. However," he paused, and a cruel smile curved his lips. "However, I must be clear about its position in my household's succession." Movement at the edge of the hall caught Nova's attention. A woman stepped forward from the shadows. Lydia Crane, with her midnight hair and knowing smile, her hand resting possessively on the slight swell of her own belly. Nova had heard whispers about Cain and Lydia, had dismissed them as jealous gossip, had told herself that a promised mate wouldn't betray her so openly. She had been such a fool. "Lydia carries my true heir," Cain said, and his voice rang with triumph. "The pup she bears will inherit my title, my lands, my legacy. As for the child in Nova's womb—" His eyes finally found hers, and what she saw there made her blood freeze. "It will serve as a spare, nothing more." The hall erupted in whispers. Nova stood frozen, her hands pressed to her belly, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he'd just proclaimed. A spare. Her pup. Her precious, innocent pup. Reduced to a backup. An afterthought. A living insurance policy in case Lydia's child failed to thrive. "You can't," she heard herself say, and her voice sounded distant, strange, like it belonged to someone else. "Cain, you can't do this. Our pup is an inconvenience I'm choosing to tolerate," he cut her off coldly. "Be grateful I'm acknowledging it at all. Many alphas would have demanded you rid yourself of the burden before the binding." Burden. The word slammed into her chest like a physical blow. Her wolf howled with rage and anguish, throwing itself against the walls of Nova's control with desperate fury. Her pup kicked again, a fluttering movement that felt like tiny fists beating against her from the inside. "I'll protect you," she promised silently, fiercely. "No matter what happens, I'll protect you." "And now," Cain continued, his tone businesslike, "there is the matter of Nova's pack standing." He gestured, and 2 guards stepped forward, their faces carefully blank. Nova took an instinctive step backward, her gown swishing against the stone floor, but there was nowhere to go. Guests blocked the doors behind her, and Kane's enforcers flanked her on either side. "The Thornwood Pack pendant," Kane said, extending his hand. "Remove it." Nova's fingers flew to her throat, where the small silver wolf hung on its delicate chain. The pendant had been her grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations of Valewood women. It marked her as pack, as family, as belonging. Without it, she would be nothing. A lone wolf, vulnerable and unprotected. "Please," she whispered, and she hated the way her voice broke on the word. "Kane, please don't do this. I've done nothing wrong. Our pup has done nothing wrong." "Your pup's existence is the problem." Lydia spoke for the first time, her voice silky with satisfaction. "You should have been more careful, Nova. Should have taken the moon tea like the other convenient bedwarmers." "I was his promised mate," Nova cried, and the words tore from her throat like broken glass. "We were to be bound today. He chose me." "I chose your father's trade connections," Kane corrected, his patience visibly thinning. "Your bloodline was acceptable enough for a secondary breeding, but Lydia's family offers far more advantageous alliances. Surely you understand, Nova. It's merely politics." Politics. Her entire life reduced to a failed political gambit. Her pup dismissed as a miscalculation, an error to be tucked away and forgotten. Something hot and wet slid down Nova's cheek. She hadn't realized she was crying until she tasted salt on her lips. The guard to her left grabbed her arm roughly, thick fingers digging into her flesh, and she cried out as he yanked her forward. "The pendant," Kane repeated. "Now." "No." The word escaped before she could stop it, pure instinct and maternal fury overriding her fear. "No, you can't have it. It belonged to my grandmother. My mother. It's mine. It's—" The guard's hand closed around the chain and pulled. Pain exploded across Nova's throat as the delicate links bit into her skin, then snapped. The pendant dropped into the guard's meaty palm, and Nova watched as he handed it to Kane with a casual carelessness that made her want to scream. "There," Kane said, examining the pendant briefly before tossing it to Lydia, who caught it with a triumphant smile. "A fitting gift for my true mate, don't you think? Every Valewood woman who wore this would be so proud." He let the mockery hang in the air before his voice hardened. "As for Thornwood's standing, she has none. She was never formally bound." Nova's knees buckled. Only the guard's grip on her arm kept her upright, his fingers bruising deep. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her wolf was howling inside her skull, a sound of such raw anguish that she thought her head might split apart. "What?" She gasped for air, fought for words. "What happens to me now?" Kane's smile was the cruelest thing she had ever seen. "Now," he said softly, "you leave." They didn't even give her time to change out of the wedding gown. The guards dragged her through the great hall, past the staring faces of wolves she'd known all her life, and not a single one moved to help her. Nova searched desperately for one sympathetic face, one person willing to stand against this injustice, but found only averted eyes and shuffling feet. They were afraid, she realized dimly, afraid of Kane's power, afraid of being cast out themselves. The doors of the hall slammed open, and bitter wind cut through the thin silk of her gown like knives. Winter had come early to the Thornwood territory, blanketing the land in deep snow and bitter cold. Nova's breath emerged in clouds of white as the guards marched her toward the border, their boots crunching through the frozen crust. She tried to struggle at first, tried to pull free, but her pregnant body was no match for their strength. One of them, the larger one with a scar across his jaw, grew irritated with her resistance. His hand connected with her temple in a sharp, stunning blow. Light exploded behind Nova's eyes. She felt herself falling, felt the cold bite of snow against her cheek, felt something warm and wet trickling down the side of her face. Blood, she realized distantly. She was bleeding. My pup, she thought frantically, hands scrabbling at her belly. Please, please let my pup be okay. Get up, the scarred guard snarled. Keep walking. They hauled her to her feet, and Nova stumbled forward on numb legs. The gash on her temple throbbed with each heartbeat, blood dripping down to stain the white silk of her mother's wedding gown crimson. She could feel her pup stirring, restless and frightened, responding to the flood of terror hormones coursing through her system. I'm sorry, she whispered silently. I'm so sorry, little one. I should have protected you better. I should have seen what he was. The border of Thornwood territory was marked by an ancient stone wall, crumbling in places, covered in moss and lichen despite the snow. Beyond it stretched the Deadlands, miles of frozen wilderness that belonged to no pack, where desperate rogues and exiled wolves eked out brutal, short lives. The guards stopped at the wall. One of them unlatched a rusted gate, hinges screaming in protest. By order of Alpha Thornwood, as executed by his beta heir Cain Thornwood, the wolf known as Nova Valewood is hereby exiled from pack territory, the scarred guard recited, his voice bored and mechanical. The old Alpha had been bedridden for months. Everyone knew that. Cain ran the pack in all but name, and no one dared question his authority. She is stripped of all rank, all protection, all claim to pack resources. Any wolf who offers her aid will share her fate. Please, Nova heard herself beg, and she hated the weakness in her voice, hated how small and pathetic she sounded. Please, I'm pregnant. The cold. My pup won't survive. Should have thought of that before you spread your legs for a wolf above your station, the other guard said, and shoved her hard. Nova stumbled through the gate, her bare feet. When had she lost her shoes? Sinking into deep snow. The cold was immediate and vicious, stealing her breath, making her muscles seize. Behind her the gate clanged shut, and she heard the guards' laughter fading as they walked away. She stood there for a long moment, frozen in more ways than one, staring at the endless white expanse before her. The blizzard had picked up while they'd dragged her through the territory, and now snow fell in thick curtains, obscuring everything more than a few feet away. Move, her wolf urged. Move or die. Move or kill our pup. Nova moved. She had no idea how long she walked. Time lost all meaning in the white wasteland, marked only by the burning in her lungs, the numbness spreading through her limbs, the weak fluttering of her pup's movements growing slower and slower. The gash on her temple had stopped bleeding. Frozen closed, she assumed, but her head pounded with each step, and her vision kept doubling, tripling, making her stumble over hidden rocks and roots. The wedding gown, soaked through with melted snow, dragged at her legs like chains. The cold had long since stopped hurting. A bad sign, she knew, a sign that her body was shutting down, and her thoughts had grown strange and disconnected, like dreams she couldn't quite grasp. Cain never wanted me, she thought hazily. I was just convenient. A womb to use, a connection to exploit. And when I became inconvenient, she tripped over something hidden beneath the snow and fell hard, the impact jarring through her swollen belly. For a moment she simply lay there, face pressed into the frozen ground, too exhausted to rise. Get up, her wolf commanded. Get up. I can't, Nova thought back. I can't. I'm too tired. I just want to rest for a moment. Our pup will die. Get up. With a grunt of pure will, Nova pushed herself to her hands and knees. The world spun sickeningly around her. Blood from her temple wound had frozen in her eyelashes, and she wiped at her face with clumsy, senseless fingers. When she looked up, trying to orient herself, she saw something through the swirling snow. Lights, distant, flickering, but definitely there. The warm yellow glow of torches or lanterns. Hope surged through her, almost painful in its intensity. She crawled toward the lights, unable to trust her legs to hold her, the silk of her ruined gown tearing on hidden rocks and frozen branches. The snow seemed to grow deeper with every inch she gained, but she forced herself forward, thinking of nothing but those lights, those beautiful, impossible lights. She made it perhaps another 100 yards before her arms gave out. Nova collapsed face first into a snowdrift, her strength finally, completely gone. The cold didn't hurt anymore. Nothing hurt anymore. And she found herself oddly peaceful as she lay there, one hand curled protectively over her belly. "I'm sorry," she thought to her pup. "I tried. I really tried." The last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was the sound of voices. Rough, male voices calling out in alarm, and the crunch of boots running through snow. Then there was nothing at all. Warmth. That was the first thing Nova became aware of. Warmth seeping into her frozen limbs, painful and exquisite all at once. She was lying on something soft, covered in something heavy, and somewhere nearby a fire crackled and popped. "I'm alive," she thought, and the realization brought tears to her eyes even before she opened them. "I'm alive. I'm—" Her pup. Her hands flew to her belly, trembling with desperate terror, but she felt it immediately, that familiar flutter of movement, and a sob of relief tore from her throat. "Easy," said a voice, low and rough. "You're safe. Both of you." Nova's eyes snapped open. She was in a tent, a military tent from the look of it, made of thick canvas stretched over sturdy poles. Furs were piled beneath her, more furs heaped on top of her, and a brazier nearby radiated blessed heat. The air smelled of wood smoke and herbs and something else, something that made her wolf stir suddenly to attention. Pine and steel and moonlight. A man knelt beside her pallet, a wooden bowl in his hands. He was perhaps 30, with broad shoulders and a warrior's build, his face marked by a pale scar that curved from his left temple down across his cheek. His hair was dark, disheveled as though he'd been running his hands through it, and his eyes? His eyes were the deep gray of storm clouds, watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "The healer said you need to drink this," he said, lifting the bowl slightly. "Willow bark and honey, for the pain and the cold." Nova tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. The man seemed to understand. He produced a water skin and helped her drink, his hand steady against the back of her head, his touch unexpectedly gentle for hands so calloused with battle scars. "Who?" she managed finally, her voice a rasped whisper. "Who are you? Where am I?" "You're in the camp of the King's 3rd Legion," the man said, "at the edge of Alpha King territory. My scouts found you in the snow about a mile from the border. You're lucky they were patrolling that section. We don't usually range that far south." Alpha King territory. Nova's heart hammered against her ribs. The Alpha King's territory was legendary, the largest and most powerful pack in all the realm, ruled by a king whose name was spoken with equal parts reverence and fear. There were old stories, told in whispers around hearth fires, about the prophecies that bound the Alpha King to his people. Ancient prophecies about blood moon children who would one day unite the fractured kingdoms. Her father had always dismissed such tales as the fearful imaginings of superstitious wolves, but something in those old stories had always made her mother's eyes go distant and sad. If she'd accidentally trespassed. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, struggling to sit up despite her body's protests. "I didn't mean to. I was exiled. I had nowhere to go. I'll leave immediately." "You'll do no such thing." The man's voice was firm, brooking no argument. "You're half frozen, injured, and heavily pregnant. You're not going anywhere until the healer clears you." Nova stared at him, confusion cutting through her fear. Why was this stranger being kind to her? What did he want? In her experience, kindness always came with a price. I don't understand, she whispered. Why are you helping me? The man was quiet for a moment, studying her face with those storm-gray eyes. Then he said, simply, because you needed help. That's reason enough. He held the medicinal brew to her lips, and Nova drank, too weak and too confused to resist. The liquid was bitter beneath the honey's sweetness, but warmth spread through her as she swallowed, easing the ache in her frozen muscles. I'm Eric, the man said quietly. Just Eric. And you are? Nova, she murmured, exhaustion dragging at her consciousness despite her best efforts to stay alert. Nova Valewood, or, I suppose just Nova now. I don't have a pack anymore. Something flickered in Eric's eyes. Anger, she thought, though not directed at her. His jaw tightened, and she noticed the way his hands gripped the empty bowl, knuckles going white. The wound on your temple, he said, his voice carefully controlled. And the marks on your arms. Someone hurt you. It wasn't a question. Nova closed her eyes, suddenly unable to bear the intensity of his gaze. I was cast out, she said, and the words felt like broken glass in her throat. By the wolf who was supposed to be my mate. He said my pup was... She had to stop, had to breathe through the pain. He said my pup was only fit to be a spare heir, that his mistress would bear his true successor. The silence that followed was absolute. When Nova finally gathered the courage to open her eyes again, she found Eric frozen in place. His expression transformed into something terrifying, pure, protective rage barely leashed behind a mask of control. He cast you into a blizzard, Eric said slowly, pregnant, injured, in nothing but a wedding gown. Yes. A growl rumbled from his chest, low and feral, and Nova felt her wolf react instinctively, not with fear, but with something else entirely. Something that made no sense given the circumstances, something that made her heart race and her blood warm. Eric must have noticed her reaction because he visibly forced himself to relax, the growl cutting off abruptly. Forgive me, he said, his voice rough. I shouldn't... You're injured and frightened, and I'm not helping by... He stopped, ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. Rest. We'll talk more when you've recovered your strength. He rose to his feet, turning toward the tent's entrance, and Nova felt an inexplicable surge of panic at the thought of him leaving. Wait, she heard herself say. Eric paused, looking back at her. Will you? She swallowed, feeling foolish. Will you stay? Please? I don't want to be alone. Something shifted in his expression, something soft and vulnerable beneath the warrior's hardness. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and Nova had the strangest feeling that he was fighting some internal battle she couldn't understand. Then, slowly, he settled back down onto the furs beside her pallet. I'll stay, he said quietly. Sleep, Nova. I'll keep watch. Nova closed her eyes, exhaustion finally winning its battle against fear and confusion. The last thing she was aware of before sleep claimed her was the sound of Eric's steady breathing, the warmth of the fire, and the strange, inexplicable feeling of safety that wrapped around her like a blanket. She was still a packless wolf, still pregnant, still hunted by the ghosts of what Cain had done to her. But for the first time since her nightmare began, she didn't feel completely alone. Nova woke to the sound of hushed voices outside the tent, male voices speaking in low, urgent tones that pulled her from the depths of dreamless sleep. For a moment she lay still, disoriented, her mind struggling to piece together where she was and how she'd gotten there. The furs beneath her were soft, the air warm with the lingering heat of banked coals, and somewhere nearby she could smell something cooking, meat and herbs and fresh bread. Her pup stirred, a lazy roll that pressed against her ribs, and Nova's hand moved instinctively to cradle the swell of her belly. The movement sent a sharp twinge through her temple, and the events of the previous day came flooding back in a nauseating rush. Cain, the wedding, the exile, the snow and the cold and the certain knowledge that she was going to die. But she hadn't died. Someone had found her. Eric, with his storm-gray eyes and his scarred face and his inexplicable kindness. She remembered his voice, low and rough, promising to keep watch while she slept. She remembered the way his hands had trembled slightly as he'd helped her drink, as though he was fighting some battle she couldn't see. Nova pushed herself upright, moving slowly, carefully, testing her body's limits. Her muscles ached with a bone-deep weariness, and her head still throbbed where the guard's blow had split her skin, but the desperate cold had retreated from her limbs. Someone had changed her clothes while she slept. The ruined wedding gown was gone, replaced by a simple linen shift and thick woolen stockings. The realization that strangers' hands had undressed her should have made her feel vulnerable, violated, but instead she felt only a vague gratitude that she was no longer wrapped in the blood-stained silk of her mother's dress. The tent flap rustled, and Nova's wolf surged to alertness, hackles rising instinctively. But it was only a young woman who entered, a healer from the herb-stained apron she wore, and the leather satchel slung over her shoulder. She was perhaps 25, with a round, friendly face and brown hair pulled back in a practical braid. "Oh, you're awake." The healer's voice was bright, cheerful in a way that felt almost jarring after everything Nova had endured. "I'm Mira. The commander asked me to check on you this morning. How are you feeling?" "The commander?" Nova's voice came out scratchy, rough from disuse. "Commander Eric." Mira was already moving toward her, setting down her satchel and reaching for Nova's wrist to check her pulse. "He's been outside your tent all night, you know. Wouldn't leave, even when Captain Aldrich offered to take over the watch. Said he'd promise to keep you safe." She smiled, a knowing little curve of her lips. "He's not usually like that. The commander, I mean. He's always fair, always kind, but he keeps his distance from everyone. Seeing him hover over a stranger like this, it's got the whole camp talking." Nova didn't know what to make of that information. She sat quietly while Mira examined her, answering questions about her pain levels and her pregnancy, and when she'd last felt her pup move. The healer's touch was gentle, professional, and gradually Nova felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. "Your pup seems strong," Mira said finally, sitting back on her heels. "Good heartbeat, good movement, a fighter, this one." She paused thoughtfully. "You're incredibly lucky. Exposure like you suffered could have been catastrophic. Another hour in that snow and—" She stopped, seeming to realize that she was treading into painful territory. "Well, you're here now, and both of you are going to be fine. I'll bring you some breakfast, and the commander wanted to know the moment you woke." She slipped out of the tent before Nova could respond, leaving her alone with her swirling thoughts. The commander. Eric had called himself just Eric, but apparently he was the commander of the King's Third Legion, a high-ranking military position, if Nova remembered her father's lessons correctly. Not the Alpha King himself, but someone with significant power and authority nonetheless. Why would such a man spend the night guarding a cast-off pregnant wolf he'd found half dead in the snow? The tent flap rustled again, and this time it was Eric who entered. He looked different in the morning light. Older, somehow. The scar on his face more pronounced, the shadows under his eyes betraying his sleepless night. He'd changed clothes since the previous evening, trading whatever he'd been wearing for a simple dark tunic and leather breeches. But he moved with the same controlled grace she remembered, every motion efficient and purposeful. Their eyes met across the dim interior of the tent, and the world shifted. It started in Nova's chest, a sudden bloom of heat that spread outward like ripples in still water, flooding through her veins, setting every nerve ending alight. Something else stirred too, something deeper, older, a power that had been sleeping inside her since birth. It vibrated through her bones, resonated with the very marrow of her being, responding to this stranger's presence in a way that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Her wolf, dormant and exhausted since the exile, surged to sudden, desperate attention, throwing itself against the walls of Nova's control with a force that stole her breath. "Mate," her wolf howled. "Mate. Mate, mate." Across the tent, Eric had frozen mid-step. His gray eyes went wide, and then, impossibly, terrifyingly, they flashed brilliant gold, the color of molten metal, of afternoon sunlight, of something ancient and primal and utterly inhuman. A sound rumbled from his chest, low and deep, a growl, but not a threatening one, a possessive one, a claiming one. Nova couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at this man, this stranger, as her entire being screamed that he was hers, that she had been waiting for him her whole life, that nothing in the world mattered except closing the distance between them and— No. The rational part of her mind clawed its way through the haze of instinct and need. She was still bound to Cain. The mating ceremony hadn't been completed, but the betrothal marks remained on her wrist, faded but present. She was still technically his, still claimed, still owned by the wolf who had cast her into the snow to die. She couldn't have a mate. She couldn't feel this way about a stranger. She couldn't. "No," she heard herself say, and her voice came out strangled, desperate. "No, this can't. This isn't—" Eric's hands were shaking. Nova could see them trembling at his sides, fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. His jaw was tight, tendons standing out in his neck, and she could see the battle raging behind his golden eyes, his wolf fighting for control, fighting to close the distance, fighting to claim what instinct screamed was his. "I—" His voice was barely recognizable, rough and strained. "I need to—" He took a step backward, then another, his whole body trembling with the effort of forcing himself away from her. Nova watched, frozen, as he fought his own nature with an iron will that spoke of decades of discipline. "I won't touch you," he said, and the words sounded like they were being ripped from his throat. "I won't. You're injured and frightened, and you don't know me, and I won't be the kind of male who—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Another growl rumbled from his chest, this one edged with frustration and desperate longing, and Nova felt an answering pull in her own body, a bone-deep yearning to go to him, to press herself against his chest, to bury her face in his neck and breathe in that scent of pine and steel and moonlight until it was all she knew. "He's mine," her wolf insisted, "ours. Why are we not claiming what's ours?" "Because I don't know him," Nova argued back, even as her body swayed toward him involuntarily. "Because I'm still bound to Cain. Because the last male I trusted cast me out to die." That thought was like cold water on the fire raging through her veins. Nova wrenched her gaze away from Eric's, staring instead at her own hands where they clutched the furs, and fought to control her breathing. "Please," she whispered. "Please, I can't. I don't understand what's happening." "The mate bond." Eric's voice was steadier now, though still rough. "You feel it too. I know you do. I can—" He stopped, inhaled sharply. "I can smell it on you. The recognition. The need." Nova's cheeks flushed with humiliation. Of course he could smell it. Wolves could always smell emotion, and whatever she was feeling right now was probably radiating off her in waves. She felt exposed, vulnerable, stripped bare before this stranger who her wolf had inexplicably decided was the other half of her soul. "I'm still bound to Cain," she said, and she hated the way her voice trembled. "The betrothal marks mean nothing." There was a sharp edge to Eric's voice now, something dark and dangerous. "He cast you out. He forfeited any claim to you the moment he— Another rough breath. The bond between fated mates supersedes any political arrangement. Your betrothal was never completed. There was no formal ceremony, no marked bond sealed. A true mate bond, one recognized by fate itself, nullifies every previous claim. You are mine, Nova Valewood, and I— He stopped himself again, visibly wrestling for control. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more careful. Forgive me. I shouldn't have said it like that. I have no right to claim you. We've only just met, and you've been through— His hands flexed at his sides. I won't pressure you. I won't touch you without your permission. I won't use the bond to manipulate you or force you into anything. Whatever happens between us, whatever you choose, it will be your choice. Do you understand? Nova stared at him, her mind reeling. He was offering her something no male had ever offered her before: control, agency, the right to choose her own fate. Why? She heard herself ask. Why would you— You're a commander. You have power. You could just— Just what? Eric's voice was quiet, gentle despite the tension still thrumming through his frame. Just claim you? Just force the bond whether you wanted it or not? He shook his head slowly, and something like pain flickered across his scarred face. That's not the kind of male I am. That's not the kind of alpha I want to be. You've already had one wolf treat you like property to be used and discarded. I won't be the second. He moved then, slowly, carefully, not toward her, but toward the entrance of the tent. Every step looked like it cost him something, like he was walking through deep water or dragging heavy chains. His wolf was fighting him, she realized. His wolf wanted to claim her just as desperately as hers wanted to be claimed. But he was stronger than his instincts. At the tent's entrance, he paused, one hand on the canvas flap. When he looked back at her, his eyes had faded from gold back to gray, though something of that otherworldly intensity still lingered in their depths. Mira will bring you breakfast, he said quietly. I'll stay nearby, in case you need anything. But I won't enter again unless you ask me to. Then he was gone, the tent flap falling closed behind him, leaving Nova alone with her racing heart and her confused wolf, and the lingering scent of pine and steel and moonlight. The hours that followed were some of the strangest of Nova's life. True to his word, Eric didn't enter the tent again, but she could sense him nearby, could feel his presence like a warm weight at the edge of her consciousness, steady and constant. Her wolf paced restlessly inside her, whining with frustration at the separation, but Nova forced herself to focus on more practical matters. Mira brought her breakfast, as promised: fresh bread and soft cheese and dried fruit that tasted like heaven after so long without food. While Nova ate, the healer chattered about the camp, about the soldiers, about anything and everything except the commander who was apparently standing guard just outside. How long have you served here? Nova asked, more to distract herself than from genuine curiosity. 3 years now. Mira's hands were busy checking Nova's bandages as she spoke, gentle fingers probing the wound on her temple. The commander recruited me from the Riverside Pack after their healer died. He has a talent for finding people who need a fresh start. A pause. Like you, I suppose. Nova didn't know how to respond to that. She was saved from having to try by a commotion outside. Raised voices, scuffling feet, the sharp crack of someone being slammed against something solid. Mira's eyes went wide. That doesn't sound good. Before Nova could stop her, the healer was on her feet and slipping out of the tent, leaving Nova alone with her pounding heart and her suddenly alert wolf. She could hear the voices more clearly now, Eric's, low and dangerous, and another male voice, sneering and contemptuous. Found her half dead in the snow, so now she's what? Your personal project? Your charity case? Watch your tone, Sergeant. Eric's voice was ice. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking, Commander. She's damaged goods. Some beta's trash, tossed out like kitchen scraps. You want to waste Legion resources keeping her alive? That's your call. But don't expect the rest of us to pretend she's anything other than... The sound of a body hitting wood came through the canvas walls, followed by a choked-off cry of pain. Nova's wolf surged forward, and before she knew what she was doing, she was on her feet, stumbling toward the tent entrance, her borrowed shift tangling around her legs. She pushed through the flap and into the cold morning air, and stopped dead at the sight before her. Eric had a soldier pinned against a wooden supply crate, one hand wrapped around the man's throat. The soldier was bigger than Eric, broader in the shoulders, but he dangled from the commander's grip like a rag doll, his feet scrabbling uselessly at the frozen ground. Eric's eyes blazed gold again, and his lips were pulled back in a snarl that revealed teeth that seemed too sharp, too long, too wolf. She is under the Crown's protection, Eric growled, and his voice was barely human, a rumble of pure alpha dominance that made every wolf in the vicinity shrink back. She is under my protection, and if I hear you speak of her that way again, if I hear anyone speak of her that way, I will personally rip out your tongue and feed it to the crows. Do I make myself clear? The soldier made a strangled noise that might have been agreement. I said, Eric's grip tightened. Do I make myself clear? Yes. The word came out as a wheeze. Yes, Commander, crystal clear. I'm sorry. Eric held him for one more moment, then released him with a sound of disgust. The soldier crumpled to the ground, clutching his throat, gasping for air. The other wolves who had gathered to watch the confrontation quickly found somewhere else to be, melting away like snow in sunlight. Only then did Eric seem to realize that Nova was standing there, watching. The gold faded from his eyes as he turned to face her, and something else took its place. Shame, she realized with surprise. He was ashamed of his display of violence. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I didn't mean for you to see that. I shouldn't have... He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign of frustration. I lost my temper. There's no excuse. Nova stared at him. This strange, scarred man who had spent the night guarding her tent, who had fought his own instincts to give her space, who had just slammed a soldier against a crate for daring to insult her. Nothing in her experience had prepared her for someone like him. You defended me, she said slowly. You were angry on my behalf. Of course I was. Eric's brow furrowed as though he couldn't understand why this surprised her. What he said was vile. You don't deserve to be spoken about like that. No one does. Kane used to let his packmates call me the breeder, Nova heard herself say, and she didn't know why she was telling him this, only that the words were spilling out before she could stop them. Because that's all I was to him. All I was ever meant to be. A womb for his heirs. A body to warm his bed until he got bored. He never once... Her voice cracked. He never once defended me. Not from his packmates, not from his family, not from anyone. And when I dared to inconvenience him by getting pregnant at the wrong time, She couldn't finish. The grief and rage and humiliation of everything she'd endured rose up in her throat like bile, choking her, drowning her. And then Eric was there, not touching her, not crowding her, just there, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell that scent that made her wolf howl with recognition. Listen to me, he said softly. Whatever that male told you about yourself, whatever he made you believe, it was a lie. All of it. You are not trash. You are not damaged goods. You are not a breeder or a convenience or a spare anything. His gray eyes held hers, steady and fierce. You are a woman who survived something that would have broken lesser wolves. You are a mother who walked through a blizzard to protect your pup. You are stronger than you know. Nova's eyes burned. She blinked rapidly, willing the tears not to fall, but one escaped anyway, sliding down her cheek before she could stop it. Eric raised his hand slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, he brushed the tear from her cheek with his thumb. The touch was gentle, almost reverent, and it lasted only a heartbeat before he stepped back again, putting careful distance between them. "You should rest," he said quietly. "You've been through an ordeal. But I meant what I said, Nova. You're safe here. No one will hurt you. No one will touch you without your permission. And if anyone dares to speak against you again, they will answer to me." He turned to walk away, and Nova felt the loss of his presence like a physical ache. "Eric," she called out, and he paused mid-step. "Yes?" She swallowed hard. Will you eat dinner with me tonight? I don't—" She twisted her hands in her borrowed shift. "I don't want to be alone." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, hope, carefully restrained joy. "If that's what you want." "It is." He nodded once, then continued walking, his broad shoulders disappearing around the corner of another tent. Nova stood there for a long moment, her hand pressed to her belly where her pup was kicking gently, and tried to make sense of everything she was feeling. She was still afraid, still grieving, still carrying the bruises, visible and invisible, of everything Cain had done to her. But something had shifted. Not hope, exactly. Hope was still too fragile a word for what she felt. It was more like the first breath after nearly drowning, raw, painful, and impossibly sweet. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the western mountains by the time Nova returned to her tent, her mind still churning with everything that had happened. Eric's words echoed in her head like a prayer she was afraid to believe. "You are stronger than you know." And she found herself pressing her palm against her heart as though she could hold on to the warmth those words had kindled there. Her pup shifted restlessly, and Nova sank down onto the pile of furs that served as her bed, one hand moving automatically to soothe the movement. "I know, little one," she murmured. "I don't understand it either. But maybe we don't have to understand everything right now. Maybe we can just be grateful that we're alive." A soft knock at the tent's entrance made her look up, and Mira's kind face appeared in the gap between the canvas flaps. She carried a small basket, clean clothes, a brush, salve for the cut on Nova's temple, and set it down with a brisk efficiency that left no room for argument. "From the commander," she said simply. "He noticed you were favoring your left side." Of course he had. Nova touched the basket's edge, unsettled by the specificity of his attention. Cain had shared her bed for months and never once noticed when she was in pain. Before Nova could respond, a commotion outside drew both their attention. Raised voices, the sound of horses, and beneath it all, a tension that made the hair on Nova's arms stand on end. Mira's expression shifted from warmth to wariness in an instant. "Stay here," Mira said firmly. "I'll find out what's happening." But Nova was already pushing herself to her feet, drawn by some instinct she couldn't name. She followed Mira out of the tent and into the golden light of the dying day, where a knot of soldiers had gathered around a group of newcomers. The strangers wore traveling cloaks of deep crimson, the color of dried blood, and their leader sat astride a pale horse that stamped and snorted as though eager to flee. He was a tall man, lean and elegant, with silver hair pulled back from a face that might have been handsome if not for the coldness in his pale eyes. Those eyes swept across the camp with obvious disdain before landing on something that made them narrow with predatory interest. Nova realized with a sickening lurch of her stomach that he was looking directly at her. "Well, well," the stranger said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent camp. "So the rumors were true. The crown has taken in a stray." He dismounted with fluid grace, handing his reins to one of his companions without looking. "I am Victor Ravencroft, keeper of the pure-blooded dawn. I've had scouts tracking the royal movements for months, and they brought me word of an expectant mother with most unusual bloodlines. I've come seeking an audience with your commander regarding a matter of spiritual importance. Nova's wolf snarled a warning deep in her chest, and her pup kicked hard, as though trying to burrow deeper into her womb. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run, to hide, to get as far from this silver-haired stranger as possible. But her feet seemed rooted to the frozen ground. Victor's smile widened as he approached, and Nova saw the way his nostrils flared, scenting her. "Fascinating," he murmured. "You carry a blood moon pup. I can smell the prophecy in your veins." "Stay away from her." Eric's voice cut through the air like a blade, and suddenly he was there, placing himself between Nova and Victor with a protectiveness that made her wolf howl with fierce approval. His shoulders were rigid beneath his cloak, and though she couldn't see his face, she could hear the barely leashed violence in his tone. Victor raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "Peace, Commander. I mean the woman no harm. I merely wish to examine her, to confirm what my order has long suspected." I said stay away from her. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Eric's hands were clenched at his sides, and Nova could see the way his muscles coiled beneath his clothing, ready to spring. The other soldiers had gone very still, watching their commander with a mixture of respect and fear. Victor's smile never wavered, but something dark flickered behind his pale eyes. "Of course. Forgive me. I forgot myself in my enthusiasm." He stepped back, though his gaze lingered on Nova in a way that made her skin crawl. "Perhaps we might discuss this matter in private, Commander? I have information that I believe you will find most illuminating." Eric didn't move for a long moment. Then, with obvious reluctance, he turned to look at Nova. His gray eyes were turbulent, storm clouds gathering on the horizon, but his voice was gentle when he spoke. "Go back to your tent. Mira will stay with you. I'll come find you when this is finished." Nova wanted to argue. She wanted to demand to know who this Victor Ravencroft was and why the mere sight of him had filled her with such primal terror. But she saw the warning in Eric's expression, the silent plea for her to trust him, and she found herself nodding. "Be careful," she whispered, and something in his face softened at the words. "Always." She retreated to her tent with Mira at her side, but she couldn't stop herself from glancing back over her shoulder. Victor Ravencroft was watching her go, that predatory smile still playing at the corners of his mouth, and when their eyes met, he inclined his head in a gesture that felt less like courtesy and more like a promise. "I see you," that gesture seemed to say, "and I will have what I came for." Nova shivered and ducked inside her tent, her hand pressed protectively over her belly where her pup was squirming in distress. She didn't know who Victor Ravencroft was or what the pure-blooded Dawn wanted with her, but she knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that he was dangerous, and that he would not stop until he got what he wanted. The hours that followed were some of the longest of Nova's life. She paced the small confines of her tent until her legs ached, then sat on her bed of furs and tried to calm her racing heart. Mira stayed with her, brewing tea and making quiet conversation, but even the healer's steady presence couldn't ease the anxiety that coiled in Nova's chest like a living thing. "Who is he?" Nova finally asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. "Victor Ravencroft." "What is the pure-blooded Dawn?" Mira's hand stilled on the teapot. For a moment she didn't answer, and when she did, her voice was carefully neutral. "The pure-blooded Dawn is a cult. They believe that the bloodlines of the old wolf kingdoms have become corrupted by mixing with lesser packs, and that only by purifying the race can we restore the power our ancestors once held." "Purifying," Nova repeated, and the word tasted like ash on her tongue. "Eliminating anyone they deem unworthy." Mira's eyes were shadowed with old grief. "Wolves born with defects. Wolves who take human mates. Wolves born under the blood moon. She paused. They believe that blood moon children are abominations, that the ancient prophecy about such children uniting the wolf kingdoms is a lie spread by the weak to justify their existence. Nova's hand went to her belly. And my pup was conceived under the blood moon. Yes. Mira reached out and covered Nova's hand with her own. But you're safe here. The commander would never allow Victor Ravencroft to harm you or your child. But Nova couldn't shake the feeling that safety was an illusion, as fragile as ice in springtime. Victor Ravencroft had looked at her like a wolf sizing up prey, and she knew, that he wouldn't be deterred by Eric's protection. Night had fully fallen by the time Eric finally came to her tent. He looked exhausted, deep lines carved around his mouth and eyes. But when he saw Nova sitting up waiting for him, some of the tension bled from his shoulders. "You should be resting," he said softly. "I couldn't. Not until I knew what happened." Nova searched his face for answers. What did he want? Why was he looking at me like that? Eric hesitated, and in that hesitation, Nova saw everything he was trying to protect her from. "Victor Ravencroft believes your pup poses a threat to his vision of wolf purity. He requested that I turn you over to his order for examination." "And you refused?" "Of course I refused." Eric's jaw tightened. "I told him that you were under the Crown's protection, and that any attempt to harm you would be considered an act of treason against the kingdom." Relief flooded through Nova, so intense it made her dizzy. But beneath the relief, fear still lurked like a shadow. He won't stop. I saw it in his eyes. He won't just accept your refusal and go away. "No," Eric agreed quietly. "He won't." He moved to sit beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth, but not quite touching. "Nova, there are things I need to tell you. Things about Victor, about the pure-blooded Dawn, about why they're so dangerous. But I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Nova looked at him, really looked, at the scars that mapped his face, the gentleness in his storm-gray eyes, the way his hands trembled with the effort of not reaching for her. This man had protected her from the very first moment he'd found her. He had defended her honor, treated her with kindness, given her shelter and safety when she had nothing and no one. "Yes," she said softly. "I trust you." Something blazed in Eric's eyes, gold flickering at the edges of gray, and for a moment the bond between them thrummed with a warmth that stole Nova's breath. Then he blinked, and the gold faded, and he was just a man again. A man who carried the weight of secrets on his shoulders. "Victor Ravencroft has been systematically eliminating blood moon wolves for the past decade," Eric began, his voice low and serious. "He believes the prophecy, that a blood moon child will unite the fractured wolf kingdoms, threatens everything his order stands for. If the kingdoms unite, his cult loses its power. So he's made it his life's work to ensure that no blood moon child ever lives long enough to fulfill their destiny." Nova's blood ran cold. How many has he killed? Dozens. Maybe more. We've never been able to prove his involvement directly. He's careful, always working through proxies and pawns. But we know. Eric's hands clenched on his knees. "And now he's set his sights on you. Because of my pup. Because of what your pup represents." Eric turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his gaze made her heart race. "Nova, blood moon children are rare, incredibly rare. For one to be born to a wolf of your bloodline, with your strength and your courage, Victor sees that as an existential threat." Nova tried to process what he was telling her, but her mind kept snagging on one detail. "My bloodline? What do you know about my bloodline?" Eric hesitated again, and Nova saw the war playing out behind his eyes, the battle between truth and protection, between what she needed to know and what might shatter her. "Your mother," he said finally. "She was born under a blood moon too. That's why she died when you were young. Victor's assassins found her." The world tilted. Nova gripped the furs beneath her, feeling like the ground had suddenly dropped away. Her mother. Her beautiful, gentle mother who had died when Nova was barely old enough to remember her face. Killed. Murdered. Because of what she was. What she'd been born as. She died in childbirth, Nova whispered. That's what my father always told me. She died bringing me into the world. Your father lied to protect you. He knew what Victor would do if he discovered what you were. What your pup would be. Eric's voice was impossibly gentle. Nova, you carry the blood of the ancient queens, the ones who ruled before the kingdoms fractured. That's why Victor wants your pup. Not just because of the blood moon, but because of what your child might become. Nova couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Everything she thought she knew about herself, about her family, was crumbling around her like a castle built on sand. And beneath the ruins, something else was stirring. Something ancient and powerful and terrifying. Her wolf, but not just her wolf. Something more. I don't understand, she managed. I'm no one. I'm just a discarded beta's mate, a packless wolf with nothing to my name. You are so much more than that. Eric reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, he took her hand in his. His touch was warm, grounding, an anchor in the storm of her confusion. You are the daughter of a blood moon queen. You carry within you the power that Victor Ravencroft has spent his entire life trying to destroy. And your pup may be the one the prophecy speaks of. The child who will unite us all. Nova stared at their joined hands. His fingers were calloused from years of sword work, his palm scarred with old burns and blade cuts. But his grip was gentle, careful, as though he understood exactly how fragile she felt in this moment. What am I supposed to do? She asked, and hated how small her voice sounded. For now, nothing. Let me protect you. Let me keep you safe while we figure out our next move. Eric's thumb traced a small circle on the back of her hand. Victor won't dare move against you directly while you're under my protection. But we need to be careful. He has spies everywhere, and he's patient. He'll wait for an opportunity, and when he finds one... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Nova thought about Kane, about the way he'd cast her out like garbage, stripping her of her pack pendant and her dignity in front of everyone she'd ever known. She thought about the soldier who had called her Beta's trash and the cold contempt in Victor Ravencroft's pale eyes. And then she thought about the power that had stirred beneath her skin when Eric walked into her tent, the way it had recognized him before her mind could catch up, as if her blood already knew what her heart was still learning. I'm tired of running, she said quietly. I'm tired of being afraid. I want to fight back. Pride flickered across Eric's face. I know you do. And when the time comes, I'll help you. But for now, please, rest. Eat. Let me take care of you. Just for a little while. Nova wanted to argue. She wanted to demand a sword, a plan, something concrete she could hold onto in the darkness. But exhaustion was pulling at her limbs, and her pup had finally settled, soothed by Eric's presence, and the warmth of his hand in hers was making it hard to think of anything except how safe she felt in this moment. Dinner, she remembered. You said you'd eat dinner with me. Eric smiled, a real smile, one that softened the harsh lines of his face and made him look almost boyish. So I did. Would you still like that? Yes. Nova squeezed his hand before reluctantly letting go. I would like that very much. They ate together in her tent, sitting on the furs by the fire while the wind howled outside. Eric told her stories about his childhood, carefully edited, she suspected, to avoid revealing too much about his true identity, and Nova found herself laughing for the first time in what felt like forever. You didn't really challenge a bear to a wrestling match, she said, shaking her head. I did. I was 12 and very stupid. Eric grinned at her. The bear won, obviously. I still have the scars on my back to prove it. Nova's gaze dropped to his chest, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks as she imagined what other scars might be hidden beneath his clothing. Eric noticed her look. Of course he did. He noticed everything, and his grin faded into something more intense. Nova, he said softly. I should sleep, she blurted, suddenly afraid of what might happen if she let this moment continue. You said I should rest. Eric nodded slowly, though disappointment flickered in his eyes. You're right. I should go. He stood, gathering the remains of their meal, and Nova watched him move with something like hunger coiling in her belly. She wanted him to stay, wanted to feel his arms around her, his chest beneath her cheek, his heartbeat steady in her ear. But she wasn't ready. Not yet. Not with Kane's rejection still a raw wound in her heart, and Victor Ravencroft's threat hanging over her head like a blade. Thank you, she said, as Eric reached the tent flap. For the truth. For all of it. He paused, silhouetted against the night. Sleep well, Nova. This time, when he left, she didn't feel the loss like a wound. She felt it like a promise, the ache of something not yet begun, but inevitable. She dreamed of golden eyes and blood moons and a voice that whispered mine, mine, mine like a prayer. She woke to screaming. The camp was in chaos. Flames licked at the edges of tents, and wolves were running everywhere, some in human form, some shifted into their beast shapes, while the clash of steel rang out through the darkness. Nova stumbled out of her tent, her heart pounding, and found herself face to face with one of Victor's crimson-cloaked followers. The man's lips peeled back in a snarl, revealing teeth that had been filed to points. "There you are, little breeder," he hissed. "The Keeper wants to see you." Nova's wolf surged forward, snapping and snarling, and she felt power, ancient, terrifying, unknown, crackle beneath her skin. But before she could act, a blur of motion slammed into her attacker, sending him flying. Eric stood before her, his sword dripping with blood, his eyes blazing pure gold in the firelight. "Run," he commanded. "Get to the horses. Go!" But Nova didn't run. She couldn't, because behind Eric, emerging from the smoke and flames like a nightmare made flesh, strode Victor Ravencroft himself. "How touching," Victor said, his crimson cloak billowing behind him like a wound in the night, the firelight casting dancing shadows across his pale features. The Crown's loyal dog, protecting his pregnant bitch. He raised a hand, and more of his followers materialized from the shadows surrounding them. "But I'm afraid this ends here, Commander. The Blood Moon abomination dies tonight. Stand down, Ravencroft." Eric's voice was steel and thunder, his sword still raised, his body a barrier between Nova and the circling cultists. "You're surrounded by Crown soldiers. This ends now." Victor laughed, and the sound scraped against Nova's nerves like broken glass. "Surrounded? My dear Commander, look around you. Your soldiers are rather occupied at the moment." He was right. Through the chaos of burning tents and screaming horses, Nova could see Eric's men fighting desperately against Victor's followers. Outnumbered, overwhelmed, struggling to hold the line. Mira was somewhere in that chaos, her slight form visible only in flashes as she ducked and wove between attackers. "You think I came unprepared?" Victor circled slowly, his pale eyes fixed on Nova's belly with an expression of such profound disgust that she felt her wolf growl in response. "I've been planning this for months. Ever since I sensed the abomination quickening in her womb. Ever since I realized the prophecy was finally coming to pass." "There is no prophecy," Eric snarled. "There's only your madness and your hatred of anything different from your twisted ideals." "No prophecy?" Victor's lips curled into a mockery of a smile. "Tell me, Commander, or should I say, Your Majesty, do you truly believe the Blood Moon children are mere legend? Do you think our ancestors invented the stories simply to frighten their pups?" Nova felt Eric stiffen beside her, and cold understanding washed through her. Victor knew. He knew who Eric really was, had probably known all along. This wasn't just an attack on a pregnant Omega, it was an assassination attempt on the Alpha King himself. I see you've done your research, Eric said carefully, and Nova saw his grip tighten on his sword. I've done more than research. Victor's gaze shifted to Nova, and something dark and hungry glittered in those pale depths. I've seen what the Blood Moon children become. I've watched them grow from mewling babes into weapons that can tear apart the very fabric of pack hierarchy. They must be purified before they can spread their corruption. You're insane, Nova whispered, her hand pressed protectively against her belly. Her pup was stirring, agitated by her fear, and she could feel power, strange, unfamiliar, terrifying, building beneath her skin like lightning gathering in a storm cloud. Am I? Victor took a step closer, and Eric moved to intercept him, but two of the cultists lunged forward, engaging the Alpha King in a brutal clash of steel that forced him away from Nova's side. Am I insane for wanting to preserve the purity of our kind? For recognizing the threat that your abomination poses to everything our ancestors built? Nova backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel her wolf straining at its leash, desperate to shift, to fight, to protect the life growing inside her. But she was too pregnant, too vulnerable, and shifting now might kill them both. Eric! She screamed as one of the cultists landed a blow that sent him staggering, blood blooming across his shoulder. He recovered instantly, driving his blade through his attacker's chest, but another took his place, and another, and Nova realized with dawning horror that they were intentionally keeping him occupied while Victor advanced on her. Your mate cannot save you, Victor said softly, drawing a silver dagger from beneath his cloak. The blade gleamed with an unnatural light. Blessed, Nova realized, inscribed with ancient runes designed to burn wolf flesh on contact. No one can save you. The Blood Moon curse ends here, little breeder. Your pup will never draw breath. Nova's back hit something solid, the stone wall of an ancient structure she hadn't noticed in her retreat. An abandoned temple, half collapsed and overgrown with vines, its entrance yawning behind her like a hungry mouth. She had nowhere left to run. Victor raised the dagger, and time seemed to slow to a crawl. Nova saw Eric fighting desperately to reach her, his face a mask of fury and terror. She saw Mira go down under a cultist's blow, her small body crumpling to the ground. She saw the flames reaching higher, consuming everything she'd started to hope for. And she saw, with sudden crystalline clarity, the choice before her. She could die here, cowering against cold stone, another victim of hatred and fear. She could let Victor end her and her pup, and everything the Blood Moon had promised. She could accept the fate that Cain had decreed for her when he cast her into the snow, that she was worthless, disposable, a vessel for an heir no one wanted. Or she could fight. The power that had been building beneath her skin surged like a wave, and Nova stopped trying to suppress it. She stopped hiding from the gift her mother had died to protect. Stopped pretending she was just an ordinary Omega with an ordinary pregnancy. She embraced the Blood Moon legacy that had made her pup a target and let it fill her with strength she had never known she possessed. Her eyes blazed with light. Not the golden glow of a shifting wolf, but something older, something primal, something that made Victor stumble backward with a curse. What? He started. You know nothing about what I am, Nova said, and her voice echoed with 1,000 generations of Blood Moon children, their power singing through her veins. You know nothing about what my pup will become. But I'm going to tell you something you do know, Victor Ravencroft, something you've been hiding your entire life. She stepped forward, and Victor retreated, his pale face going even whiter. I know about your mother, Nova continued, the words rising from somewhere deep within her, from the prophetic gift that her pup was sharing with her through their unbreakable bond. I know about the night you were born. The blood moon hung in the sky, and your mother looked into your eyes and saw what you were, what you've always been, one of us. Lies, Victor spat, but his hand was shaking, the blessed dagger trembling in his grip. You're lying. I am pure. I am. You murdered her in her birthing bed. Nova's voice rang out across the burning camp, and the fighting stuttered to a halt as wolves on both sides turned to listen. You were only hours old, and already the power was too strong, too wild. You killed your own mother before she could tell anyone what you really were. And you've spent your entire life destroying blood moon children because you can't destroy what you hate in yourself. Victor's followers were staring at him now, horror and doubt creeping across their faces. These were true believers, men and women who had dedicated their lives to the pure-blooded Dawn's doctrine of genetic purity. They had followed Victor because they believed him to be their prophet, their guide, their shining example of what a proper wolf should be. And now they were learning that their prophet was the very abomination he had taught them to despise. It's not true, Victor insisted, but his voice cracked, and Nova saw the admission in his eyes, the guilt he had carried for decades, the secret that had twisted him into the monster he had become. His whole body was shaking now, not with rage but with the weight of denial finally, utterly shattered. She was weak. She was going to expose me, to ruin everything before I could. He stopped, staring at his own hands as though they belonged to a stranger. I didn't mean to. I was just a babe. I didn't understand what was happening. But she looked at me like I was a demon, and I couldn't bear it. I couldn't bear her disgust. Before you could build your cult of hatred? Nova interrupted. Before you could murder innocent children to feel powerful? Before you could convince yourself that killing enough of us would somehow make you pure? Victor's face contorted with rage, and he lunged at her with the silver dagger raised. Nova threw her arms up instinctively, and the power exploded out of her in a blinding wave of light. The blessed weapon shattered in Victor's hand, fragments of silver scattering across the stone floor of the ancient temple. He screamed as the force of the blast threw him backward, his cloak torn and smoking, his pale skin burned where the runes had backfired against him. Nova stood her ground, breathing hard, her hands still raised, her eyes still blazing with that otherworldly glow. She could feel her pup's presence in her mind, but not one presence. Two. Two distinct souls sharing her womb, each one pouring its own thread of power into her, lending her their strength, their fierce infant will, their unwavering belief that their mother could protect them. Twins. She had never known. Mira had heard one heartbeat, Eric had sensed one life, but they had been hiding, curled around each other like two flames sharing a single wick, their power so perfectly entwined that no one had detected them until this moment when they chose to reveal themselves. Blood moon twins born of the ancient bloodline, awakened by the very threat that sought to destroy them. The knowledge settled into her heart like a key sliding into a lock, and Nova understood finally why Victor had been so desperate to destroy her, why the prophecy had terrified him so completely. Your followers are leaving, she said quietly, watching as the crimson-cloaked cultists backed away from their fallen prophet, their faces twisted with betrayal and disgust. They trusted you, and you lied to them. You made them complicit in your self-hatred. It's over, Victor. The pure-blooded Dawn dies tonight. Victor struggled to his knees, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild with madness. You think you've won? He spat blood onto the stones. You think exposing me changes anything? I'm not the only one who fears what your abominations will become. There will always be those who see blood moon children as threats, as weapons, as hope. Eric's voice cut through Victor's ranting, and Nova turned to see him limping toward them through the smoke. His shoulder was bleeding heavily, and there was a gash across his forehead that dripped crimson into his eyes. But he was alive. He was standing. And his eyes, blazing pure gold in the firelight, were fixed on Nova with an expression of such fierce pride and love that her breath caught in her throat. Blood moon children have always represented change, Eric continued, coming to stand beside Nova, his hand finding hers and gripping tight. Evolution. Growth. That's why wolves like you fear them, Victor. Not because they're abominations, but because they represent a future you can't control. You're the Alpha King, Victor said, and his laugh was bitter and broken. You're supposed to maintain order, preserve tradition. How can you stand there and— I stand where my mate stands, Eric interrupted. I defend what she defends, and I will build the future that our children deserve, all of our children, whether they're born under a blood moon or not. Victor's remaining followers had melted into the shadows, their faith shattered, their purpose destroyed. Only Victor himself remained, kneeling on the cold stone floor of the ancient temple, stripped of his power and his followers and his carefully constructed lies. What will you do with me? He demanded. Execute me? Make me a martyr for my cause? No. Eric's voice was cold and final. I sentence you to exile in the hallowed wastes. You'll spend the rest of your days among the wolves who have been cast out of every pack, every kingdom. Wolves who have no power, no status, no hope. You'll die alone and forgotten, Victor Ravencroft, and the world will move on without you. Victor's face went gray with horror. For a wolf who had craved power and influence above all else, this was a fate worse than death. To be stripped of everything he had built, everything he had believed in, and abandoned to obscurity. You can't do this, he whispered. I am the keeper of purity. I am— You are nothing, Nova said quietly. You are a frightened child who has spent his whole life running from what he really is. And now you're alone. Crown soldiers materialized from the smoke, their faces grim and determined, and they hauled Victor to his feet without ceremony. He struggled briefly, screaming curses and threats, but his voice faded into the distance as they dragged him away, and then there was only silence. The fire was dying down. The cultists had fled. The battle was over. Nova's legs gave out, and she would have fallen if Eric hadn't caught her, his arms wrapping around her with desperate tenderness. Nova. His voice was rough with emotion. Gods, Nova, are you— the pups? Twins, she whispered against his chest, her face buried in the warmth of him. We're having twins, Eric. I felt them. They helped me. They gave me the strength to— He kissed her before she could finish, his mouth claiming hers with a hunger that stole her breath and set her blood on fire. She kissed him back, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world gone mad. And when they finally broke apart, she saw tears tracking through the blood and soot on his face. I thought I was going to lose you, he breathed. I thought, when Victor— I couldn't reach you in time and You didn't lose me. Nova reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the pale scar that curved from his temple down across his cheek, the place where his jaw was clenched tight against overwhelming emotion. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. Eric closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against hers, and for a long moment, they simply breathed together, savoring the miracle of their survival. Then Mira's voice cut through the silence. Commander? My lady? We need to move. More of Ravencroft's people might be coming, and you— She looked pointedly at Eric's shoulder. You're bleeding rather heavily, Your Majesty. Eric laughed weakly, and Nova felt the sound vibrate through her chest where they were pressed together. Mira's right. We need to get you somewhere safe. We need to get you to a healer, Nova corrected, eyeing his shoulder with concern. Can you walk? I can do anything with you beside me. The words were simple, sincere, and they made something break open in Nova's chest, the last wall she had built around her heart, crumbling into dust. She loved this man. This scarred, stubborn, impossibly gentle Alpha King who had wrapped her in his cloak and slept across her tent entrance and defended her honor against anyone who dared to question it. She loved him, and he was hers. They made it to the royal pavilion that the soldiers had established at the edge of the camp, and Nova insisted on tending Eric's wounds herself despite his protests that she needed rest. She cleaned the gash on his shoulder with careful hands, stitched it closed with thread and needle borrowed from Mira's kit, and bandaged it with strips of clean linen. "You're good at this," Eric murmured, watching her work with hooded eyes. "I had to learn. When you're Omega and nobody cares about you, you learn to take care of yourself." Nova tied off the last bandage and sat back on her heels. "There, you'll have another scar to add to your collection." "I don't mind scars." Eric reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "They tell stories. This one will remind me of the night my mate saved my life." Nova's breath caught. "I didn't save. You did." Eric sat up, wincing slightly, and cupped her face in his hands. "Victor had me pinned down. He was going to kill you, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. But you stopped him, Nova. You used the power you've been afraid of your whole life, and you stopped him." "I was terrified," she admitted. "I didn't know if it would work. I didn't know what I was doing." "That's what courage is. Being terrified and doing it anyway." Eric's thumb stroked across her cheekbones. "You are the bravest person I have ever known." Nova felt tears prick at her eyes. No one had ever called her brave before. Kane had called her worthless. Her old pack had called her damaged. But Eric looked at her like she was a warrior, a queen, a force to be reckoned with. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. "Something I've been too afraid to say." Eric's eyes searched her face. "You can tell me anything." "The bond between us." Nova took a deep breath. "It's real. It's not just the pregnancy hormones or the trauma or the fact that you saved my life. I feel it, Eric. I feel you. And I know I'm still technically mated to Kane, but that bond is broken. It has been since the moment he threw me away. What I feel for you is real," Eric finished, his voice rough with emotion. "It's real for me too, Nova. From the moment I found you in the snow, I knew. My wolf knew. You're my true mate, the other half of my soul. I've been waiting for you my whole life." Nova's wolf howled with joy inside her chest, and she felt her pups stir in response, their tiny souls reaching out toward their father with recognition and love. "I want to be marked," she whispered. "I want to belong to you completely, officially. I want the world to know that I'm yours and you're mine, and nothing will ever separate us again." Eric's eyes flashed gold, and she saw his wolf surging to the surface, desperate to claim what was his. But he held himself back, his jaw tight with the effort of restraint. "Are you sure?" he asked. "It's been a long night. You're exhausted. And the pups?" "The pups want their father," Nova interrupted. "They've been reaching for you since the moment you stepped into my tent. They know you, Eric. They love you. And so do I." The words hung between them, fragile and precious, and Nova watched Eric's face transform with wonder and hope and fierce, overwhelming love. "Then let me mark you," he breathed. "Let me claim you as my mate, my Luna, my queen. Let me give you everything I am and everything I have and everything I will ever be." "Yes." The single word was barely past her lips before Eric was on her, his mouth finding hers with desperate hunger. Nova kissed him back with everything she had, her fingers tangling in his hair, her body arching against his, her wolf singing with joy. He lowered her gently onto the furs, his injured shoulder apparently forgotten, and Nova felt the heat of him pressing against her, his chest, his hips, the hard length of him straining against his trousers. She should have been afraid. She should have thought of Cain and all the ways he had used her body without caring for her pleasure or her comfort. But this was Eric, and Eric would never hurt her. Eric had slept across her tent entrance for 3 nights rather than presume to touch her. Eric had held her hand through her nightmares, and brought her warm broth when she couldn't eat, and defended her honor against anyone who questioned it. Eric was safe. "I'm going to mark you now," he murmured against her throat, his lips tracing the sensitive skin where her neck met her shoulder. "It will hurt for a moment, and then—" "I know." Nova tilted her head back, offering him access, trusting him completely. "Do it. Make me yours." His teeth grazed her skin, and Nova shivered with anticipation. She could feel his wolf surging against his control, desperate to claim, to bite, to mark what was his forever. She could feel her own wolf rising to meet him, ready to be taken, to be owned, to belong. When his fangs sank into her flesh, the pain was sharp and bright and absolute, a bolt of lightning that shot through her entire body and stole her breath. She cried out, her back arching, her fingers clutching at Eric's shoulders, and for a moment, there was nothing but the agony of his teeth in her flesh. Then the pleasure hit. It crashed over her like a wave, drowning out the pain, flooding her with sensation so intense that she thought she might shatter. She could feel Eric, not just his body against hers, but his soul, his essence, his very being, pouring into her through the bond that was forming between them. She felt his love, his devotion, his fierce protectiveness. She felt his wolf claiming hers, their spirits intertwining until she couldn't tell where she ended and he began. "Mine," Eric growled against her skin, his voice barely human. "My mate, my Nova, my queen." "Yours," Nova gasped, her vision blurring with tears of joy. "Always yours." He released her throat and licked the wound closed, his tongue gentle against the sensitive flesh, and Nova felt the mark settling into her skin like a brand, permanent, unchangeable, a symbol of their bond for all the world to see. As the new mark bloomed on her neck, she felt the old betrothal marks on her wrist fade and disappear, burnt away by the truth of her actual mate claim. But she wasn't finished. "My turn," she whispered, and she saw Eric's eyes widen as he understood. "Nova, you don't have to." "I want to." She pushed at his chest until he rolled onto his back, and she straddled him, her hands pressed against his bare chest, her eyes locked with his. "I want to mark you the way you marked me. I want everyone to know that you belong to me as much as I belong to you. I want—" "Yes." Eric's voice was raw with need. "God's. Yes. Mark me, Nova. Claim me. Make me yours." She leaned down, her lips finding the junction of his neck and shoulder, the same place where her own mark still throbbed with new-formed power. She could smell him, pine and musk and something uniquely Eric, and her wolf surged forward, desperate to complete the bond. When she bit, she felt his blood on her tongue, warm and rich, and tasting of power and forever. She felt his body jerk beneath hers, his hands clutching at her hips, his breath coming in ragged gasps. And she felt the bond explode between them like a supernova, filling her with light and warmth and the absolute certainty that she would never be alone again. "Mine," she whispered against his skin, echoing his earlier claim. "My mate, my Eric, my king." "Yours," he answered, his voice breaking on the word. "Always and forever yours." Nova released his throat and watched the mark form on his skin, a perfect match to her own, their wolves' teeth leaving identical imprints. She had marked the Alpha King. She had claimed him as her own. And no one, not Cain, not Victor, not anyone in all the kingdoms, could ever take that away from her. Eric pulled her down against his chest, cradling her in his arms, and Nova felt the bond settling between them like a golden thread connecting their hearts. She could feel his emotions as if they were her own, his overwhelming love, his fierce protectiveness, his bone-deep contentment at finally being complete. "I love you," he murmured into her hair. "I've loved you since the moment I saw you lying in the snow, so fierce and brave despite everything that had been done to you. I'll love you until the day I die, and beyond." "I love you too." Nova pressed her face against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I didn't think I could ever love anyone again after Cain. I thought that part of me was broken forever. But you fixed it. You fixed me. You were never broken." Eric's arms tightened around her. "You were just waiting for someone who deserved you." They lay together in the warmth of the pavilion, their bond humming with contentment, their pup settled and peaceful in Nova's womb. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the camp being restored to order, soldiers calling to each other, the crackle of fires being extinguished, the soft whickers of horses being calmed. It was over. Victor was defeated. The pure-blooded Dawn was destroyed, and Nova was finally, truly, home. 3 months later, Nova stood in the great hall of the royal palace, a crown of silver and moonstone resting on her brow. The assembly before her stretched back as far as she could see, pack leaders and nobles and common wolves alike, all gathered to witness the coronation of their new Luna Queen. Eric stood beside her, resplendent in his formal robes, his own crown glinting in the candlelight. His hand found hers and squeezed, and she felt his love pulsing through their bond like a heartbeat. "People of the realm," Eric said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall, "I present to you Nova Valewood, marked mate of the Alpha King, Luna Queen of all the kingdoms. May her reign be long and prosperous, and may her wisdom guide us into a new age of peace." The roar that went up from the crowd was deafening. Nova felt tears prick at her eyes as she looked out at the sea of faces, wolves who had come from every corner of the realm to celebrate her, to accept her, to acknowledge her as their queen. A movement caught her eye in the back of the hall, and she saw a small delegation from the Thornwood pack, including Cain himself, looking pale and diminished in his finest clothes. He had been forced to come, forced to kneel before the mate he had thrown away and acknowledge her new status. Nova met his eyes across the crowded hall, and she saw the regret in them, the dawning realization of what he had lost. For a moment she felt a flicker of the old pain, the old humiliation. Then Eric's hand tightened on hers, and she felt his love wrapping around her like armor, and the pain dissolved into nothing. "I was going to refuse to grant them an audience," Eric murmured, too soft for anyone else to hear. "But I thought you might want the satisfaction." "I don't need satisfaction," Nova said quietly. "I have everything I could ever want." Let him see what he threw away. Let him live with that knowledge for the rest of his life. That's punishment enough. Eric smiled and lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "My wise and merciful queen." Later, after the ceremony was over and the celebration was in full swing, Nova slipped away to the royal nursery. 2 cradles stood side by side, carved from moonwood and draped with the finest silks, and in each one lay a tiny form, a perfect, precious miracle. Her pups had been born a month ago, under a blood moon that had turned the entire sky crimson. The birth had been difficult, as twin pregnancies always were, but Nova had survived, and her daughters had emerged screaming and healthy and already showing signs of the power they would one day wield. "They're beautiful," Eric said from behind her, and Nova turned to find him watching her with soft eyes. "They're perfect," she agreed, "our little blood moon princesses." Eric came to stand beside her, one arm wrapping around her waist as they gazed down at their sleeping daughters. "I've formally registered them as my firstborn heirs," he said. The announcement will go out tomorrow to every pack in the realm. Kane's spare will be the future of the entire kingdom. Nova laughed softly, remembering the horror on Kane's face when he'd been informed that the pup he'd rejected would one day rule over him. I almost feel sorry for him. Almost. Don't. Eric pressed a kiss to her temple. He made his choice. Now he lives with the consequences. One of the twins stirred, her tiny face scrunching up in displeasure, and Nova reached down to stroke her cheek with one gentle finger. The pup settled immediately, her small hand reaching up to clutch at her mother's touch. I never thought I could be this happy, Nova whispered. After everything that happened, I never thought. You deserve this, Eric interrupted. You deserve happiness and love and a family who cherishes you. You always did. It just took the world a while to realize it. Nova turned in his arms and kissed him, long and sweet and full of promise. Their bond hummed with contentment, with love, with the absolute certainty that they had found each other against all odds. Come to bed, Eric murmured against her lips. Our daughters are sleeping, and the celebration will go on without us. Is that an order, Your Majesty? He grinned, and the expression made him look young and boyish and absolutely devastating. Consider it a royal request. Nova took his hand and let him lead her toward their chambers, already anticipating the warmth of his body against hers, the pleasure of his touch, the intimacy of their bond. Behind them, their twin daughters slept peacefully in their moonwood cradles, dreaming of blood moons and golden eyes and a future full of possibility. And in the great hall below, the celebration continued long into the night, as wolves from every pack in the realm toasted the Alpha King and his Luna Queen, the scarred soldier and the discarded Omega, who had found each other against all odds and built a love that would echo through the ages. Victor Ravencroft sat alone in the hollowed wastes, stripped of his power, his followers, and his carefully constructed lies. The prophecy he'd spent his life trying to destroy had instead destroyed him. And somewhere, in the royal palace, blood moon twins slept under moonwood cradles, their futures as limitless as the night sky. It was, everyone agreed, the beginning of a new era, and it was only just getting started.